Mark Anderson's hands clenched into fists as he watched the world he had fought so hard to protect burn beneath the blood-red sky. His knuckles were raw from the constant beatings he had delivered and taken in hand-to-hand combat over the years. But none of that had prepared him for the overwhelming sense of helplessness that now consumed him. The Dragul, an unstoppable race of reptilian conquerors, had reduced Earth to a smoldering graveyard. Everything was gone. Friends, family, civilization, all wiped out in a matter of months by the ruthless invaders who had swept through the galaxy, leaving nothing but ash and ruin in their wake. He had once been a fighter, a mixed martial arts champion before the invasion. His life had been about discipline, control, and pushing his body to its limits. He fought for glory in the cage, an unstoppable force in the octagon. Fame and respect had come with his victories, and for a time, Mark believed he had found his purpose. But when the Dragul descended, all of that seemed small and meaningless. The real fight began when they arrived, and everything he had trained for took on new significance. Mark wasn't just a fighter, he became a soldier. He'd led a group of survivors in a makeshift resistance after Arantz governments crumbled a Dragul assault. They fought in the streets, in the shadows of destroyed cities, trying to hold on to whatever scraps of humanity they could salvage. But it wasn't enough. The Dragul's military might was far beyond anything Earth had ever faced. Their war machines larger than buildings, their soldiers relentless and without mercy. Every battle was a loss, every skirmish more futile than the last. The Dragul were unstoppable, and Mark had to accept that truth long before others did. His rebellion had been crushed, his comrades slaughtered. And in those final days, with nothing left to fight for, escape became the only option. Mark's fingers trembled slightly as he gripped the controls of the Free Star, the aging spacecraft that had become his last refuge. The ship wasn't built for war or speed. It was an old cargo hauler, modified to carry passengers, most of whom had barely any experience in space travel. But the Free Star had one thing going for it. It could get them off the planet. And that was all that mattered when the Dragul started annihilating Earth's surface with orbital bombardments. As the Free Star broke through the atmosphere, Mark caught his last glimpse of the planet he had called home. The once blue oceans had turned black with smoke, the continents ablaze under the relentless firepower of the Dragul ships. Earth was dying, and Mark knew it was only a matter of time before it became just another dead world in the Dragul's endless conquest of the galaxy. The escape had been chaotic. It wasn't just the Free Star that fled. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of ships like it, all filled with survivors hoping to outrun the invaders. Families, soldiers, refugees, everyone was trying to escape in any way they could. Humanity had scattered into the stars like shattered glass, each ship breaking off on its own trajectory, hoping against hope to find safety in the vastness of space. Mark had no illusions about what came next. They were adrift in the cold, merciless void, with no real destination. The ships had no coordinated plan, no leader to guide them, just the desperate hope that somewhere out there they might find a new home. Or at the very least, escape the Dragul's reach long enough to survive a little while longer. The Free Star was packed with around 50 people, most of them in shock or too exhausted to think beyond the next hour. The air inside the ship was heavy with a mix of fear and resignation. The passengers were a cross-section of Earth's final days: civilians, scientists, a few ex-military types, and Mark's resistance fighters, though their numbers had dwindled to just a handful. Each had their own story of survival, but none of them mattered much anymore. They were united by a single grim truth. Earth was gone, and they were alone. Captain Richards, the ship's aging pilot, was an ex-NASA engineer who had never imagined commanding a ship like this. His voice crackled over the intercom regularly, giving updates on their journey, though his tone was increasingly weary. The hope that they might find a habitable planet to rebuild humanity had begun to fade after days of endless drifting through space. Fuel was low, food and water were rationed carefully, and the stress of survival weighed heavily on everyone. Mark spent most of his time in the cramped galley, sitting at one of the makeshift tables, staring at the walls. Conversations around him were quiet, muffled by fear and exhaustion. Occasionally someone would ask him what they should do next, but Mark had no answers. He was a fighter, not a leader. Not anymore. His only plan had been to escape the Dragul. Beyond that, there was nothing. The future felt empty, and the weight of that emptiness pressed on him like a boulder. One of the other passengers, a scientist named Dr. Helena Morgan, had been one of the few people to keep busy during the journey. She had set up a makeshift lab in the back of the ship, running what limited scans and analyses she could with the Freestar's outdated equipment. She was a quiet woman, in her mid-30s, with short black hair and sharp, analytical eyes. Mark had come to respect her dedication, even if she barely spoke to anyone unless absolutely necessary. "Captain," Helena's voice broke through the silence one day over the ship's comm system. "I'm picking up something on long-range sensors. It's a ship." The crew gathered in the control room, peering at the screen that displayed the distant object. It was massive, far larger than any Earth vessel, and it seemed to be drifting on the edge of the solar system. Apprehension settled over the group like a shroud. "Could it be one of the other human ships?" someone asked, hopeful but hesitant. "Too big," Richards muttered, his eyes fixed on the readings, "and it's not broadcasting any human signals." "Dragul?" Mark asked, stepping forward, his voice low and tense. The idea that the Dragul could have followed them chilled him to the bone. They had seen firsthand what those reptilian monsters were capable of. Richards shook his head. "Doesn't match Dragul signatures either." The crew stood in uneasy silence. Fear had become second nature at this point, and no one wanted to be the one to make the wrong decision. But staying adrift wasn't an option either. "Establish contact," Mark finally said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We need to know who they are." Richards nodded and initiated the signal. They waited in tense silence, the seconds dragging out painfully, each one carrying the weight of uncertainty. Finally, the ship's comms crackled to life, and a calm, mechanical voice filled the control room. "This is the Arantz Collective. We come in peace. You are safe. We offer you sanctuary." The tension in the room shifted, but the unease didn't disappear entirely. The promise of sanctuary sounded too good to be true, especially after what they had just escaped. Mark could see the apprehension on the faces of those around him. They had been burned too many times to trust easily. "Do we have a choice?" Captain Richards asked, his voice heavy with the burden of leadership. Mark crossed his arms and stared at the screen. The ship, this Arantz vessel, was their only option. They had nowhere else to go. Fuel was running low and their supplies wouldn't last forever. Even if this was a trap, it was a risk they had to take. Better to face something unknown than die slowly in the void. "Bring us in," Mark said quietly, his decision final. The Freestar docked with the Arantz vessel, a ship so vast that it dwarfed their own craft. As they floated into the massive hangar bay, the sheer scale of the alien ship became even more apparent. The walls were alive, pulsating with organic material that seemed to grow from the ship itself. Strange segmented limbs extended from the ceiling, monitoring the incoming humans with eerie precision. As they disembarked, the survivors were greeted by a contingent of Arantz guards, tall insectoid creatures with spindly limbs and large compound eyes that reflected the light of the hangar. Their mandibles clicked in unison as they gestured for the humans to follow them deeper into the ship. Despite the Arantz's calm and formal demeanor, the atmosphere was tense. Mark watched their every movement, his instincts on high alert. The Arantz had promised safety, but something about the situation felt off. There was a chill in the air, a sense of unease that gnawed at the back of his mind. Still, they followed, with nowhere else to go. The Arantz led them into a large chamber, where more of the insect-like beings awaited. The humans were lined up and separated into small groups, each one undergoing some sort of scanning process. The Arantz moved quickly, their insectoid limbs moving with mechanical precision as they scanned each human, their compound eyes studying them intently. It was then that the first shackles appeared. One by one, the survivors were restrained, their wrists bound in heavy metallic cuffs. Confusion rippled through the crowd, and fear quickly followed. The promise of safety had turned into something far more sinister, and the humans realized they had been deceived. They were prisoners, not refugees. Mark felt the cold metal clamp around his wrist, and that was when something snapped inside him. He wasn't going to be taken without a fight. Not again. The guard reaching for him was tall, its limbs thin but strong. Mark moved before it could react, his body acting on instinct honed from years of combat. His fist connected with the creature's abdomen, and it let out a sharp, high-pitched screech. Mark followed up with a swift elbow to the side of its head, sending the insectoid crashing to the ground. Chaos erupted in the chamber. Other Arantz rushed to subdue Mark, but he wasn't done. He ducked and weaved, landing blows with the same precision he had used in the cage back on Earth. His body moved on autopilot, years of training taking over as he fought with everything he had. But the numbers were against him. No matter how many he took down, more kept coming. They overwhelmed him, their spindly arms locking him in place, forcing him to the cold, alien floor. As they pinned him down, Mark's chest heaved with exhaustion, but the fire in his eyes remained. They had deceived him, deceived all of them. The Arantz stood over him, their mandibles clicking in what seemed like amusement as they shackled him, binding his wrists and ankles. Mark struggled against the restraints, but it was futile. They had won, for now. As they dragged him to his feet, his mind raced. He had fought the Dragul and lost. He had fought the Arantz and lost. But there would be other chances. He would find a way out of this. He would fight again, and next time, he wouldn't lose. The dim, flickering lights of the Arantz ship cast long, eerie shadows over the narrow corridors as the prisoners were herded like cattle. Mark Anderson's hands clenched at his sides, his wrists still sore from the shackles that had bound him after the struggle in the hangar. Every muscle in his body screamed for action, for a chance to strike back, but there was nothing he could do. Not yet. The humans had been separated into small groups, each group taken to different parts of the ship. Mark watched as men and women, some he had fought beside on Earth, were led away, their faces etched with fear and helplessness. His own group, just 7 people, had been shoved into a cell with cold metal bars that stretched from the floor to the ceiling, creating a cage within a cage. Each one was small and cramped, offering no privacy and no way to communicate with the others. But the Arantz ship wasn't only holding humans. As Mark paced his own cell, trying to make sense of their situation, he couldn't help but notice the other prisoners held in similar cages scattered around the area. They weren't all human. In the dim light, he could make out the forms of several other species, each one unique and strange in its own way. Some were tall and slender, their skin glistening with a strange, iridescent sheen. Others were squat and muscular, their bodies covered in coarse fur or rough, reptilian scales. Most of them looked just as broken and defeated as the humans. There was no sense of camaraderie among them, no shared sense of hope or purpose. Whatever species they came from, they were all captives, just like Mark and his people. And they were all being held for the same reason, whatever dark purpose the Arantz had in store. The sound of hissing and clanging filled the air as the Arantz guards opened the cell doors. Without a word, they began dragging the prisoners from their cages, shoving them roughly into lines. The guards moved with mechanical precision, their insectoid limbs clicking and tapping as they herded the captives deeper into the bowels of the ship. Mark was among the last to be pulled from his cell. The alien guards seemed to have taken a particular interest in him after his earlier defiance. They shoved him harder than the others, their compound eyes narrowing in what he could only assume was a mixture of contempt and amusement. They led him into a larger holding area, and this time, the cell he was placed in was different. It was far larger, big enough to accommodate a dozen beings. And as soon as he was shoved inside, Mark realized he was no longer just with humans. The creatures in this new cell were vastly different from the terrified refugees he had seen earlier. They were warriors, each one with a presence that immediately set them apart from the rest of the prisoners. Some stood tall, their chests broad and their arms thick with muscle, while others had an air of deadly grace, their movements fluid and precise. One thing was clear, these beings were fighters, just like him. Mark's eyes scanned the room as he took stock of his new cellmates. There was a creature with dark, leathery skin and tusks jutting from its jaw, its massive arms crossed over its chest as it glared at nothing in particular. Another, a slender, almost feline figure with elongated limbs, crouched near the far corner, its eyes gleaming with a predatory glint. A third, covered in thick, reddish scales, was sharpening what looked like a bone knife against a stone it held in its clawed hand. Mark cautiously approached the nearest one, a large, broad-shouldered alien with what looked like dark fur covering most of its body. Its eyes were hidden beneath a heavy brow, and its nostrils flared as Mark drew closer. "Hey," Mark said, his voice steady but low, trying to get a sense of what was going on. "Do you understand me?" The creature didn't respond with words. Instead, it grunted, a deep, guttural sound that made Mark's skin prickle. It didn't turn to face him, didn't even acknowledge him beyond that single sound. Clearly, it wasn't interested in conversation. Mark backed off, keeping his eyes on the others. None of them seemed particularly eager to talk. There was an unspoken tension in the air, one that felt heavy and suffocating. Mark wasn't sure why he had been thrown into this group, but it was obvious these beings were here for a reason. And then it hit him. This was no ordinary group of prisoners. They weren't just survivors, they were warriors, just like him. Whatever the Arantz had planned, it was becoming clearer by the second. Hours passed, or at least what felt like hours. There were no windows, no way to tell time in the cramped metallic confines of the Arantz ship. The only sounds were the soft hum of the ship's systems and the occasional scuffle between cellmates as they shifted uncomfortably. Then, without warning, the doors to their cell slid open with a loud hiss, and the Arantz guards returned. They gestured with their long, spindly arms, motioning for the prisoners to follow. There was no resistance. Every creature in the cell stood up, ready to move, as if they already knew what was coming. Mark fell into line with the others as they were marched down a series of twisting corridors. The walls seemed to pulse with an unsettling organic quality, as if the ship itself was alive. The faint, rhythmic thrum beneath his feet felt like the heartbeat of some massive, slumbering beast. He didn't know where they were being taken, but the further they went, the more a sense of dread settled into his chest. The Arantz were hurting them with purpose, and every instinct told Mark that whatever awaited them wasn't good. Finally, they reached a large set of doors at the end of the corridor. The doors were enormous, made of some strange metallic material that shimmered under the dim lights. As they opened, a wave of sound rushed out, a mixture of voices, laughter, and strange, alien sounds that sent a chill down Mark's spine. They stepped through the doors into a vast chamber, and Mark's eyes widened as he took in the sight before him. It was an arena. The chamber was packed with hundreds, if not thousands, of alien spectators. They filled the stands that surrounded a central ring, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Some of the creatures in the crowd were massive, towering over the others with thick, scaled hides or gleaming metallic armor. Others were small and wiry, their limbs twitching with barely contained excitement. In the center of the chamber was the ring itself, a large, octagonal structure surrounded by tall posts that crackled with an energy field. The force field shimmered with a faint bluish hue, enclosing the ring in an impenetrable barrier. It reminded Mark of the cages used in MMA fights back on Earth, only this one was far deadlier. Mark's stomach twisted as realization sank in. This was a fighting pit. The Arantz had brought them here to entertain the crowd, to fight for their lives in front of a bloodthirsty audience. He scanned the arena, his mind racing. This was it. This was why he had been separated from the other humans, why he had been placed with these warrior creatures. The Arantz had chosen them to fight, to kill, for the amusement of the alien spectators. The crowd roared as the prisoners were led toward the edge of the ring. Mark's pulse quickened. He had fought in cages before, had faced opponents in the octagon, but this was different. This wasn't a sport. This was life or death. As the warriors were herded into position around the ring, the energy field flickered and solidified, locking them inside. The crowd's cheers grew louder, their alien voices creating a cacophony of excitement and bloodlust. Mark could feel the tension radiating from the creatures beside him. The air was thick with anticipation. None of them spoke, but the looks on their faces told him everything he needed to know. They had been through this before. They knew what was coming. Suddenly, a booming voice echoed through the arena, speaking in a language Mark couldn't understand. It was deep and guttural, but the meaning was clear enough. The fight was about to begin. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him like a freight train. This was no ordinary fight. He was about to be thrown into a gladiatorial battle, not just against other warriors, but against creatures from across the galaxy. Each of them was trained to kill, and the only way out of this ring was to survive. The doors to the arena floor closed behind them, leaving them trapped inside the octagon. Mark squared his shoulders and steadied his breathing. He had fought his whole life. This was just another fight, only the stakes were much higher. The crowd fell silent for a moment, the anticipation hanging in the air like a weight. Then, with a deafening roar, the fight began. Mark's instincts kicked in immediately. He darted to the side, narrowly avoiding a massive swing from one of the creatures, a hulking brute with thick armored skin and a hammer-like fist. He moved quickly, dodging and weaving as the alien warriors launched into combat with terrifying ferocity. There was no hesitation, no mercy. This was a battle for survival, and every creature in that ring knew it. Mark ducked beneath a swing and lashed out with a punch, his knuckles connecting with the soft flesh beneath another alien's jaw. It let out a pained hiss and stumbled back, but there was no time to follow up. Another opponent was already coming at him. Mark's mind raced, his years of MMA training taking over. This was no ordinary fight. He was facing beings from across the galaxy, each with their own unique strengths and weaknesses. But he wasn't going to go down without a fight. Not here. Not like this. As the chaos of the battle consumed the arena, Mark's thoughts shifted to one thing: survival. He would fight, and he would win, because he had no other choice.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe and visit the channel for more interesting sci-fi stories and content.